Allow me to introduce a good friend, a colleague, and a comrade. He's Louis Cardinal. He's a communicator and educator. He has dedicated his life work to creating and maintaining connections and relationships that cross cultural divides. His long track record of public service currently includes a board member of the Theatre Network Society, vice chair of the Documentary Organization of Canada, chair of the Global Indigenous Dialogue of Initiatives of Change Canada, and trustee and chair of the Indigenous Task Force for the Council for a Parliament of World Religions. He's received the Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee Medal for public service and the Platinum Jubilee Medal for his contributions to the province of Alberta, as well as the Inspire Award for public service. He's got a lot of awards. I'm surprised they're not all on your chest. They probably weigh you down a little bit. He's also won the province of Alberta's Centennial Medal for his work in human rights and diversity. He's a distinguished alumni award from Grant MacEwan, an honorary degree of Doctor of Sacred Letters from St. Stephen's College at the University of Alberta. And then maybe as importantly, Louis is a Woodland Cree from the Sucker Creek Cree First Nations in Treaty 8 in northern Alberta. His consulting company, Cardinal Strategic Communications, specializes in Indigenous education, communications, and project development. He's also the owner, CEO, head storyteller, and chief storykeeper of Red Earth Blue Sky Productions. And he's also currently the project manager for Kichikwa Aski, which is sacred land. It's here in the city of Edmonton. It's really a remarkable achievement. It's the first designated urban Indigenous ceremony grounds in Canada. It's a remarkable achievement, and I know he's been working on it for many years.
Thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate it. Thank you, Jason. I hope my eulogy's that good. It's great to be here. I am always feel at home when I come to this conference. I know many of you, and many of you know me, or at least know of me. And I just want to extend my gratitude to Parkland for consistently, after 27 years, doing this sort of conference, because these are the kind of dialogues we need as progressives. We need to come together, we need to agree, and we need to disagree. But through that, we learn, and through that, we become more knowledgeable in terms of what we need to do as human beings and taking care of our little part of the world. I'm grateful to all of you being here as well. I know that I'm the last speaker for the conference, so that was like no stress whatsoever, but I'm going to work through it the best that I can. Before we start, I wanted to just talk a little bit about myself, putting myself into some context here outside of the accolades that were just shared. I am Woodland Cree. I come from the Mustus and Cunningham and Willier families. Really a family story of leadership. I'm also a genealogy nerd, and so I've done a lot of research. And from that, I've come to a realization that we can achieve reconciliation through genealogy. And that's because once you start to look deeply into the roots of where you come from, you'll be surprised what you find and where it goes. And suddenly Uncle Bill isn't, okay. Anyway, but it's a way in which I've really sought a way to understand my role in this life and the work that I do and why I do the things that I do. But it's also a story of how we connect to Canada in such a deep way. And I'll talk about that in a little while. One of my rite of passage as a young man was running from Edmonton here to the American Museum of Natural History in 1988. So you can do the math in terms of how old I am, to retrieve a sacred bundle that belonged to Chief Big Bear for our people. And that was my rite of passage. And that's what really led into really understanding the roots of my family, but really beginning to understand the roots of the Canadian family. It became the way in which prepared me to do the work that I need to do, but it certainly was defined for me what I wanted to do at that young age. I wanted to go out and to become a storyteller, to relate these stories and things that I was finding. So I went to University of Colorado at Boulder, got into education and filmmaking and all that. And then I really got involved in teaching people how to write, expository writing more specifically. So I was invited to teach while I was going to University of Colorado at Boulder, then came back home here, continued to teach, went into education, did my PhD studies in Indigenous people's education. And the funny thing about education is that it's a very political thing. Because I was working with the Indigenous community here in the city said, hey, listen, we want you to run for city council. So I did, if you remember that, 2007. And then I jumped into federal politics and ran in 2014. But it became a place in which I could really understand how systems work. It also became a place in where how I can develop that urban indigenous advocacy and capacity development, which I've done. And so from that, then, it brought me back into the grounding of my culture and my identity, and working then with the importance of ceremony, which is why it's led me into doing the building of the first Kichikau Aski, sacred land, is what that means. So it is the first in Canada. And it was a really great experience to work with the city, who became, eventually, a very strong supporter and full partner in that exercise of reconciliation that we like to talk about. As was noted before, I did get involved in the global Indigenous relations, did a lot of work with international gatherings with Indigenous people, and now I'm returning back to my roots again and wanting to become that storyteller. I'm just starting to produce my very first documentary series for APTN called Carry the Bundle, the Cardinal story. But it's a look at Canada. If anything, if you want a high concept, it's the Indigenous people's history of Canada, and how we look at that through the family ties and linkages we have, and how it all ties to treaties and reconciliation and all these sorts of things. It's a labor of love, and I get to work on it when I'm not doing all these other things. So I've been very fortunate for that. But first, I wanted to welcome you all to this journey of reconciliation I'm hoping to take you on. One of the important things about this is that we need to have good and honest questions that leads to healing and leads to good relations. So here are some of the questions that come forward, and this will kind of guide this conversation. I hope to address them all in one form or another. Is reconciliation a destination or a journey? Are we seeking reconciliation or reconciliation? Is reconciliation a neo-colonial trap? Reconciliation has become an R word, and there's a list of R words we need to know for us to see what genuine reconciliation can look like, and what are they? Is reconciliation the right word for what we hope to achieve? Is reconciliation a noun or a verb? These sorts of questions are really kind of flowing around the Indigenous community as well, and also within the non-Indigenous community. And so I hope to address some of those things here. But I think first, what I need to do here is to kind of give you an overview, an Indigenous perspective on reconciliation. And we need to get back to some basics here, because I think once we understand more about the foundations of Indigenous worldviews, we're more capable to have the conversations that we need. Because the Indigenous worldview comes from a different perspective in how we look at life and how we integrate ourselves in our life. And so reconciliation then is also a word, it's a process, it's something that really helps us to keep that balance as well. So the first note is the use of the word indigenous. It comes from indigena, means springs from the land or is born from the land. But it has deeper meaning, so that's connotation. The denotation is this. It's a relational concept. It's about being in relationship to. And from that, we have a truism that Indigenous people say all the time. It's all about relationships. Because the concept of indigenous and the name of indigenous is the first time Indigenous people have given themselves, in this contemporary age, a name for themselves. Cree, for example, is a name that's been placed upon my people, the Nehewak. I am Nehel, Nehewak is our people. That Cree comes from the French word Christino, which means the anointed ones or the Christian ones. And when it's shortened from Christino, the French gave us that, it's shortened to Cris. And then Cris, anglicized, becomes Cree. And so that's how we get the name Cree and where it comes from, but it has nothing to do with us. And so we recognize within this worldview that the natural and the spiritual worlds are really connected, and that in fact we are a part of that spiritual connection as well. That's one outstanding thing that I've found in working with many Indigenous nations throughout the world, is that they agree that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, is the adage. But it's something that really puts us into a place of humility, because we realize that we, as human beings, are not it. We are only a part of it. And so we recognize that there's more reality that meets the eye, and that all things are created sacred. Everything on this planet, everything in this room is created from Mother Earth. And so all of these things have life force in them. There is life in this podium. Don't tell Sarah Huckabee that. Everything has that mother's creation from it. And we also have that as human beings as well. And so what's important about that is that we need to maintain relationship. It becomes a really important process. Reconciliation can also be seen as a ceremony. But it's a lot of work. And ceremonies, in some of our traditions, are not easy things to do because it pulls you from the inside. It helps you to face certain struggles and things that you're dealing with in your life or dealing with within your community. Ceremonies, in so many ways, become like our Robert's Rules of Order, in that we have to learn how to live in balance and harmony with everything around us. Because everything does have that right to be here. And we call that, to understand that, we call it walking in a sacred manner. And that we are related to all these other beings and life forms, and that we recognize that we have to be careful as human beings in what we do. Because what we do, the decisions that we make, has an effect on so many other forms of life on this planet. And so within that, then, is this great concept of the circle of, a great circle of life. All living things sit in council in our philosophy. And so we as human beings only have but one seat in that great circle. But we also know that we have responsibility and stewardship to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. And that we're just not the only thing in the center of it, that we are a part of all this creation. So it humbles us to know that we need to be able to walk in that balance and that harmony. And again, it goes back to that point of ceremony as being an important part of keeping us and maintaining us in the things that we do. Because we recognize that there is uniqueness in creation, and that each person considered a gift from the Creator. One of the stories that the elder women had taught me is that when a child is born, they come out with their hands like this, nothing else, but they have their fists closed. And why is that? It's because they're carrying the gifts, the talents, and the uniqueness of who they are. Nobody is a duplicate of another person, even identical twins. They're still different in their own way. Because it's believed that at one time in the past, someone from your family, your community, your nation had prayed at a time when they were asking for help, guidance, and direction. So the Creator heard that prayer and then sent you. Each one of you were sent down carrying those gifts that uniquely make you who you are in your hands. And then it becomes our responsibility as parents, as grandparents, as aunts, uncles, as the extended family, as the community, to create and nurture a space where that safety can be felt and that embrace can be felt, where those hands can slowly start to open, to nurture that young person to become the person they need to become, to acknowledge those gifts and talents. Because eventually, as the elders say, that person will go on to do what they need to do in a good way in order to bring their gifts forward. So we need to understand that each person is sacred by that value. Each person is unique. Each person has the right to be heard and the right to speak. And so the same thing exists with families and clans as well, and nations, that we recognize that ceremonies and knowledge and traditions are unique to each one of those as well. So within communities and traditional indigenous communities, you will see different clans and different family groupings that do specific things that that nation needs to do. Or even when you go into a community, there are families that are uniquely gifted in athletics and whatever, art, things like that. And the community tends to go to those people and ask them to help with what the needs are in the community. So from that, you start to build on the strength of your community. It becomes your assets, is within the people of who you are. We recognize that they have something to offer. And that's why we use like talking circles, because we allow each person to share their perspective. For example, if we're sitting in a circle, and in the circle is let's say there's a tree trunk there, a nice large tree, an oak tree, whatever you want to call it. And then on that tree, at the base of it, as people tend to do, they carve things on there, and initials, names, symbols, that sort of thing. So if we're to sit in a circle, and the task is to identify what we see on that tree trunk, I would start, and I would say, okay, well, this is what I see, this and that, and then the next person goes, and then they start to explain that, and so forth and so on, until it goes around the circle. What we've done, without us moving, is that the person directly across from me is telling me something I don't know, because I just can't simply see it, because life makes us different and unique that way, because of our perspectives. And so then, when we do that, then we say, okay, the next task is, what do those symbols mean? And again, from the uniqueness of our positions and our perspectives, we move around that circle, and we begin to educate each other. We begin to get a multidimensional understanding of what that tree trunk is saying, or what those symbols are saying on it, because we're able to share from our uniqueness what those things mean. So remove the tree and put in a social problem in the middle of that as well, and bring people together to take a look at that problem, and unique groups of people as well, because it's quite surprising where you might find the answer that you're looking for. It's not always hidden somewhere deep. Often we're holding it in our hands, but never given the opportunity to express those things. In 2005 to 2006, we did something here in Edmonton called the Edmonton Urban Aboriginal Accord Relationship Agreement process. What that meant was we went out and we asked simple questions to the community. What are our concerns? What are our issues? What do we think we need to see in the future? So we went throughout the city. And for the first time in Edmonton's history, all of our people spoke with one voice. And because of that, the voice of the people led the way. And what we learned from that is when the people speak, the leaders follow. Because then, once we did our reporting and we knew what we needed to do, then all levels of government aligned their funding envelopes to feed those concerns. So if somebody wanted to get money from a certain envelope, like housing or something like that, they say, okay, how are you responding to this report, these issues and these concerns? What it did, though, was it really brought the community closer together. It started to build trust. You know, now we have the Kitchikowasky sacred land. That process, because of that process, we were able to come together, even though we still have differences as different parts of the Indigenous community. But when the elders came together and they all looked in the same direction and spoke with one voice, this is the time we need to do this. It changed the relationship because we had been out of balance with each other. That's why a lot of things we couldn't do, even though we knew we needed them, we couldn't agree with each other until we go through these processes, and then it shows itself over and over of how that effort can work. With each nation, then, they also have their gifts and their collected knowledge and their wisdom and their technologies. And so us as Indigenous people had recognized that when the first newcomers came. You know, it wasn't like, you know, what's their problem? We're saying, hold it, you know, they've got some pretty cool stuff over there, and I think I want to trade with them. So, you know, what do you have? What do you got? You know, you want to trade? But it's about learning from each other, which was really important as well, that knowledge. And then we developed through those relationships, those early relationships in trade, is how we can support each other. And then how we can work together. And then for a very long time, it was a way of how we can protect each other as well. Treaties then become a very important part of this story of reconciliation. Because treaties should not be looked upon as being contractual agreements. It's not transactional in the way that we think it is. It's not, well, you get this, I get that, and we just will have peace between each other. It goes a lot deeper. Treaties, in the very first treaties that we know about, they talk about things like, and we shall be like family. We shall be like siblings. So there was a long-standing tradition of peacemaking here in the Americas long before the Europeans came. We were already making treaties with other nations, so we understood the importance of that. We understood that treaty and treaty making is a very sacred ceremony, and it's witnessed by the Creator. That's how deep it goes. And one thing that a lot of people don't know is that these ceremonies, in order to make treaties with other nations, are known as the making of relations, or in some languages we say, adding to our relations. We become family. These are important concepts to remember because it's at the heart of what Canada is. You know, it's a nation of family. That's the intent. That's what we understood when we were making these treaties. So what's the golden rule? Is you do not make war on your family. Rather, you go to them when they are having difficult times. You celebrate them when they're having good times. You stand together for that mutual benefit of continuing and that mutual benefit of success. It's really important for us to remember that treaty is sacred text. It's a guide for how we can walk together in a sacred manner. Again, looking at treaties through this way, it becomes important for us to re-see how we are as Canadians. The treaties of peace, for example, like all treaties here in Canada, are treaties of peace from how we look at things. The Haudenosaunee, for example, have the great law of peace, extending the roots of peace underneath the grounds. I don't know if you know much about trees. I know some, but not too much. I know some trees, they grow through seeds, but you have other trees that send out roots underneath the ground, and then they pop up, right? So when you look at it like a poplar stand or an aspen stand, in the center is the mother, right? And then all those trees are out there. That's the metaphor that the Haudenosaunee were using, is that these roots of peace are like that, where we extend them out, and around us then becomes like family. Then through that, we would restore relations and relationships as a part of that treaty-making process, because built within each of those processes is a renewal strategy, a renewal process. Because like family, you have to maintain those relationships. Family maintenance is the term I hear a lot, right? So it's not, Thanksgiving, it's family maintenance time, because, I have to go and be nice and, listen to Crazy Phil and all his stories. But it's just coming together and accepting who we are and celebrating together and enjoying each other's company. That's family, and those are the sort of values that we're hoping to see once again. And within the traditions of treaties, there was confederacies as well. And confederacies, again, is just another version of that large circle, except we're coming together to honor the difference of who we are and knowing that we can benefit from who the other nations are without them having to lose their identity or assimilate into something else. So it becomes something a lot more. And as we know, peace and trade are the same word in many indigenous languages, because you need peace in order to trade, but you also need trade in order to establish peace as well. The first treaty I want to talk about here is the Two-Row Wampum in 1613. The Two-Row Wampum is a pretty simple-looking wampum belt. It's about this big, about 6 inches wide. It has 3 white stripes, and in the middle of those white stripes are 2 purple stripes. And they talk about how 2 ships go side by side in relationship to each other, bounded by those 3 white stripes that represent peace, respect, and friendship. And so it's a way in which we link together. And from that first treaty, that was the very first one, 1613, between the it was the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee. And then when the Dutch were pushed out, then the British came in, and so they returned in about 1667 with a new treaty, and that was called the Covenant Chain. And that word covenant kind of mistranslated, but how the Haudenosaunee explain it is that it's about being linked arm to arm, together as relatives. Within these treaty-making processes, it becomes a framework of how Canada can interact with Indigenous people. And so for like almost 200 years, there was a relevancy to Indigenous people in the relationship with Europeans that came here. It existed. Of course, nothing's ever perfect. People make mistakes. People become destructive. And that's the thing about us as human beings, is that we walk out of balance fairly easily. You know, we take too much. We become destructive. But the opposite is also true. We can do amazing things and good things as well. That is truly our nature. It's always that struggle between what we know to be right and what we know to be wrong. And that's just a common human denominator in who we are. So those treaties are meant to maintain balance and harmony. And so what's important in this point on this slide here is that when the Royal Proclamation was brought forward in 1763, once the French were moved out of control, Upper Canada, or whatever we wanted to call it at that time, is that there was a convening of over 2,200 Indigenous leaders from the eastern seaboard right up to the Great Lakes, some into the plains. They came together because William Johnson, the superintendent of the Northern Department from the British Empire, recognized that if they didn't maintain those peace treaties that they had already with the Haudenosaunee and other nations, because other nations joined in with the Haudenosaunee, with the Two-Row Wampum and also with the covenant chain, and things were going south. So he recognized if he did not address that, then they were going to have issues. But he was inspired by that because chiefs were going to him and saying, listen, you're not living up to this relationship. We have a problem, and it's going to get worse. And he goes, oh, okay, well, he goes, why don't we get together in Niagara? So in 1764, they gathered in Niagara. Johnson sent copies of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 to all of those chiefs, all of those leaders, to let them know what the intentions of the Crown of the British Empire was going to do. And so they gathered, and they talked about the issues and the problems that they were having with the British and where it was going to go. They spent 2 weeks together. And they came out of that talk with this thing called the Silver Covenant Chain. It's also known as the Treaty of Niagara. But the Silver Covenant Chain was sticking to the same principles that the Two-Row Wampum and the Covenant Chain were. Because with the Covenant Chain, they use a reference, a metaphor of 3 iron chains that would link us strong like iron, like people linked together arm to arm. But the thing with iron is that it rusts, right? And so the metaphor then became silver. So silver became 3 links of silver. But what was added to this covenant was that when it tarnishes, because silver tarnishes, then we have to come together and to make it shine again. We have to work to make sure we polish it again. That's an act of renewal. And so we recognize that through our whole ceremonial process, that there's always that renewal aspect of things when relationships are starting to come apart. You know, we went forward, and of course, there's 2 births in 1812, and that's the birth of Canada and the Indian problem, and the work towards cultural genocide. And it became so unbridled that it was just bold after a while, because Indigenous people were not relevant anymore militarily or even in the production of goods and trade. They come away, and I call it the Good Intentions Paving Company, it's what I call the Canadian government, because you know that road they built? The colonization policies really became, as they would use language, well, we're trying to do something good for you. We're trying to pull you out of your primitive state, and we're going to teach you technologies and all these sort of things. These ideas started to come into fruition and in full force. Campbell Scott, for example, I think he said this one, kill the Indian, save the child, localize the Indian and get the land, because once you were forced onto certain pieces of land, you no longer had access to whatever you can do. Then it falls into the hand of the invaders. And then also, you know, saying that we got all this, we're in the age of enlightenment, which was a kind of a joke in itself, for us anyway. And so these were the intentions that kind of drove why they were doing sorts of things. And then with the attitude of Indians have to be watched over. So we became technically wards or children of the state. We lost control over everything. Even profits and monies that were allocated for Indigenous people were put into trusts. And there are many numbers floating out there as how much money are in those trusts still today. It's estimated as high as $1 trillion, but it's certainly in the billions. But the thing with that is somebody's looking after your money or looking after your land, where is it? So a lot of the legal issues you're hearing about in the news is about these cases where we're saying, okay, now we can represent ourselves, because we couldn't represent ourselves legally by lawyers until 1951. So a lot of things we could not defend ourselves from legally. And of course, we didn't have any military might to speak of at all. So then it takes those things away from us in terms of what we need to do. So simple questions is where's the money, where's the land, and when do we get it back? These are the questions that are being played out now. Another attempt by the Good Intentions Paving Company was the 1969 White Paper, the Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy. Again, another bold attempt to totally assimilate Indigenous people into the body politic of Canada. Because, of course, Trudeau at the time, being the scholar that he was, had read Plato's work, and he said this Canada and his vision was becoming a just society. And so, my Uncle Harold Cardinal wrote a book called The Unjust Society, just shortly after that, in '69. And I remember he used to come over to our house, and he was the president of the Indian Association of Alberta at that time, from 1968 to about 1975. And I remember him, my father, other people sitting around the table, leaders. I mean, it was a confluence of Indigenous thinkers right around our kitchen table for the longest amount of time. Historical people like George Manuel, for example, and various names like that. And so, but they were talking about how this response was necessary and what we needed to do. So the white paper then is really making its way through with little to next consultation with Indigenous leadership. But we responded. The chiefs of Alberta with their elders and Harold at the lead responded with the red paper, what was called Citizens Plus. And that changed everything. The struggle for us to maintain the recognition of our treaties and how we have a unique relationship in Canada. In 1966, there was a report called the Hawthorne Report that identified Indigenous people in Canada as Citizens Plus. That's where that term came from. The Citizens Plus, or the red paper, was something that was really articulated well by Indigenous elders. Also the use of our traditional ceremonies as well. And our traditional philosophies were put into that. And so when we pushed back the federal government on that, then what happened was it opened up a new avenue for us to move through. And it really became quite a watershed, because it changed. It became actually the red paper, or Citizens Plus, actually became the policy framework for the government of Canada. And then it leads towards the constitutional inclusion and the recognition of rights of Indigenous people in 1982. So we see that shift starting to come. But because that shift was happening, it didn't mean that the struggles were over. We have and had to become, and we still have to become, very vigilant in what it is that's going on. And that's why reconciliation becomes a very important word to analyze and an important thing to really take seriously, because it can be used either way. Most people I know are in full favor of reconciliation. But what they don't know is that there's other sides to it that have to be taken into consideration. For example, reconciliation and other R words. When I was writing this, I realized, holy smokes, there's a whole bunch of R words. So I picked these five: reparations, restoration, rematriation, revocation, and repudiation, right? So when we talk about reparations, pretty much, it's something that you do after you've made an apology. You know, it's something that you do to pay back the damages in someone's property, or replacing what was broken, or replacing what was stolen. It's an act of restitution, but it's a step towards healing a relationship. And it is an act of courage. So it's as simple as recognizing that through reparations, that really we're trying to, what's the legal term? Make one whole, I guess is the term. That making one whole is going to take a while yet for us to really get there. But that's a part of this journey, though. And rematriation, I like that word rather than repatriation, because rematriation really is returning home, back to the embrace of our mother. That's what Indigenous people really want, is we want to go back to be able to utilize our ceremonies, traditions, philosophies within the contemporary context. We want that cultural revival, that spiritual renewal, and ceremony has to become a foundational part of how we govern ourselves. And also releasing imprisoned cultural and ceremonial items. It's only recently that museums are now moving forward and starting to release items to Indigenous people, communities, and nations. The organization I work with is called the Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Center, and so the Kichikauaski project fits underneath there. But another project we're engaged with is the return of the sacred Manitou stone, and I don't know if a lot of people know the story of that, but it was taken away where it landed out by Hardisty, Alberta, thousands of years ago. And it was a place of pilgrimage for Indigenous people all over this region. They used to go there and make offerings to that stone. It was also known as the Buffalo Stone. So then one late night, a certain individual by the name of McDougall came along with a buckboard and some helpers, and they removed the stone and took it away in the middle of the night. And he had it in front of his missionary school for a while, and then eventually he sent it to Toronto, where it languished for 100 years, and then it was returned to Edmonton in about 1970. And so that now we've been able to have this government, the previous leader, commit to working to return it. And we were able to work with and our elders who are leading this, were able to work with the museum to agree to let it go, to return it back to the people. So now we're identifying the lands where we want to place it, building a structure to take care of it, and so it's starting to move forward. And it's a prophetic stone as well, because when it was taken back in 1860, they said, you'll see now that our buffalo stone has been removed, that people will suffer, and it'll be a long, dark time before we return. But when we return the stone, you will see our people come back. Because when the buffalo left in the 1880s, our people also left in so many ways. We were then confined to these First Nations. But now, when we see the stone is about to be returned, it'll take a couple of years before we actually finish all the work on that. But we're seeing the growth of Indigenous people, finding our way into the institutions, finding our way into the heart of Canadian society and Canadian life. So it's that prophecy that's returning to it. Also, the importance of getting back our names, recovering our stories, remembering our families, finding our children. All these are about rematriating, getting us back into the intention of who we are and the traditions of who we are. And these Indigenous traditions can and have coincided with and parallel with the Canadian experience. It's actually a part of the Canadian experience. And so we cannot see it as something that is outside and separate. There's no, sovereign push to create a nation within Canada, because we're already nations. And so we have to keep that in mind as well, because oftentimes they're saying, well, how are you going to be sovereign in Canada? Well, we're doing it so far. The other thing, of course, is restoration. Land claims, getting back the land that's been lost, the control of the trusts, gaining and regaining financial control. Indigenous governance and decision-making processes are really important. Unfortunately, by law, the Indian Act still dictates how we are to govern ourselves. We elect a chief every 2 or 3 or 4 years. The funny thing about that is chief is, it's another French word. It comes from French word chef, which means the head of something. And I like to remind my cousins, because they kind of trade the the chief's hat in my community because we're all related. And so, I always kindly remind them, I said, chief in our language means, we say okimau, right? That's the word for the leader or a leader. And it translates, okimau translates into a big person. But it's not a person of physical stature, but because you can carry the weight and responsibility of leadership, people can see that and they'll say, oh, that's okimau, So they'll go to that person and ask for help and things like that. But I said, the word chief translated in Cree means okimawikan. Okimawikan translates into fake leader or pretend leader. So I like to remind them that after election night is all done celebrating. Again, applying stewardship over traditional lands, implementation of treaty and indigenous rights, but also remembering the adoption ceremony, remembering those family ties, and remembering those arms that we're linked together with. And so, of course, repudiation and revocation. I was here when the Pope was reading his repudiation. Repudiation is just simply saying that was a bad idea, didn't like it, it didn't work. It's not revocation. Revocation is turning that document and making it politically inactive, I guess you can say. And it does have issues on land ownership to a large degree in many different areas. But at least it's a step forward, because now, again, like the apology we received in 2008, his apology has to follow with action, right? And so that's what we're looking for. So apparently from my contacts, not that I have contacts in the Vatican, but I have contacts of people who are working with the Vatican, and there's something coming out that's going to come out soon. I don't know if it's the repudiation, but it's something that they're going to do that's going to have a lot more meaning to it than just an apology. And what I've learned from putting this together is that the R list just keeps growing, and that just shows that we still have a lot more to learn, because words have power, and we need to recognize that the words that we use really can define what a relationship is going to be. And I'm not going to read them all, but you kind of get the idea, right? And so the questions, back to those questions that I had at the beginning, and that is, are we seeking reconciliation or reconciliation? And one of the concerns that I have is that there's a lot of repetition going on, empty rituals, social media warriors, for example, right? And what I mean by that is that things are being done, like land acknowledgements, that really don't have the meaning they were intended to have. And so we're kind of losing something from that. And it's easy to be hypercritical with something you don't agree when you're on your computer and a distance away and you're disguising yourself as somebody else, and then suddenly you just let loose. That's not the true way in which human beings have relationships, of course. And so we have to be aware of that as well. We need more of this. We need the grassroots to really come together. Elijah Harper, one of my mentors, when the Reconciliation Commission was created, I asked him that question. I said, Uncle, why aren't you on that commission? And he said, I was asked, but I said I didn't want to do it. Because he goes, I fundamentally believe that if Canada is to ever achieve true reconciliation, it will only be when the people sit together and talk. It's from us that we make change. Remember what I was saying? When the people lead, the leaders follow, right? So we do have that power still to make those changes, make our government make the changes that we need to have. And it's by coming together like this that's going to be really important. So with the land acknowledgements, I remember writing the first one for Don Iverson here in the city, the first when he was elected mayor. There were two parts to it. The first part was acknowledging that Indigenous people were here and this is their traditional territory, and then listing all these names, right? And it's kind of like, great. But after that, it was the importance of acknowledging the relationships that we have with each other, the principles and the values of that adoption ceremony that we call treaties. That, I thought, was the most powerful part, because that's more tangible than just listing a number of people who used to be here, right? It becomes something that's more practical. That means you recognize this relationship. And you're a part of that relationship. So then it should challenge us to do something and to do something together. Lesson 1, land acknowledgements are done by settlers, okay? Don't invite an Indigenous person here to do a land acknowledgement. It has to be done by the settler because it's an act. It's a positive act. You're recognizing something. Second point is, add in the relationship value to that as well. And celebrate that, because that's what we need to recognize more and more. Because again, back to that family connection and that sort of thing as well. And is reconciliation neo-colonial trap? Yes, it can be. Absolutely. There's things going on now that are disguised as an act of reconciliation. Oh yes, you can manage your traditional lands, but you have to report to us, right? And it's like being invited to dinner, finally, and not being able to order from the menu. Because what happens, too, is because, especially when it comes to the issues of dealing with money, it becomes this paternalism, again, about how you're going to do it and where's it going to go and all this. Of course, Indigenous people know that. Our traditions are very rigid about accountability and what you need to do and fulfill, and how you are accountable for your actions. So that's something already built, hardwired into our traditions. And so self-government becomes another trick as well if we're not careful with that. And what does that mean? You know, we're talking, self-government is not sovereignty. That means we're not getting a chance. And when we talk about sovereignty, I'm not going in that area of trying to separate from Canada. The reason why is because Indigenous people who have these treaties, we cannot leave that because it's a sacred covenant that is meant to last forever. What it does mean, though, is that we have to work diligently to maintain the relationships in the best way that we can. Honor the existence of this nation, but also honor the existence of ourselves in relationship to the nation. So some of these self-government agreements are kind of tricky in terms of how you will maintain control. We had a lot of criticism about the creation of Nunavut, right? We said, oh, they wanted all of it, but they got none of it. They negotiated their deals, and of course, they made their decision on what they wanted to do. But if you look at how the voting population is going to shift and how that will shift power away from them once again in the future sometime is something to consider. And I think that should be brought into a deeper discussion later. So, is reconciliation a noun or a verb? Well, Indigenous languages are verb-based languages. As my good friend Leroy Little Bear said, you know, English is nonsense. You know, because we're verb-based, right? Naming the pain and labeling problems are not enough to make change. And we do that a lot. All kinds of research stuff and everything shows exactly the amount of pain, how intense it is, and what the problems are and how it's to the problem. But it's not enough to take that, but we need to move forward and address those issues. And a lot of the social programming that we need within the Indigenous communities are not being allowed because it's not falling within the guidelines of how that department spends its money. We still have to jump through so many hoops, like 7 different levels just to get your house built on a First Nation. That's the stuff we still have to deal with today. And of course, actions are proof of intent. Because like in our human relationships, when I hurt someone, my words hurt someone, my actions hurt someone, I have to take responsibility for it. I have to own up to it and do what I can to make that effort. But it's not different from when a community does something to another community or nation to another nation. Because it's a human construct, we built these things. And so we have to recognize that our commitment and intent has to be expressed through action. There's always the idea that, you know, we must do something. But you can do it individually, you can do it within your community, you can do it within your organization, you can do it as a nation or a province. This is what is going to help bridge those differences and start that real deeper process of healing. But it is a two-way street. Indigenous communities are going through a reconciliation process as well. You know, there's a lot of hurt within our community, a lot of it also perpetrated by ourselves. So we are going through that process. So sometimes when you see Indigenous people are duking it out on, a debate stage or out on the street or something, there's issues that still need to be addressed, and we're trying to address them in the best way that we can. But we're starting to see a shift. Now that we're having full access to ceremony, culture, and traditions, we're starting to see our people really ground themselves more in who they are and what they need to do, and then engaging more fully in the Canadian society. It is happening. It's not as quickly as we'd like to see it, but it is something that is really starting to take shape. So, I remember the time. Okay, so reconciliation, a destination, of course, it is not a destination. See, a destination is an intent, right? The journey is the work. It's when we are actually doing something. And the question of, will we ever get there? Because there's so much talk about reconciliation in the media that people are saying, oh, geez, when is this ever going to end? Well, it's up to you, really. But we need to keep doing this because sometimes, like in a journey, guys will get this or not get this. We get lost on a journey. We need to stop. We need to eat. We need to refuel and ask for directions. We forget about that. And I think we're in a very interesting situation now where we need to start to assess once again. And is reconciliation the right word? So we do need to utilize the language to invigorate more or new meanings into the words we are, because we're at this point, this crossroads, as to how are we going to take the next steps in reconciliation, knowing what we know now, because we didn't know this in 2008. It was a good idea, but we did not have the insights that we have now, or the awareness we're starting to develop. And it's not just for us, it's about all of us. We're starting to see something different. We're starting to see potential start to rise, but we are still surrounded with that potential of negativity and control and those sorts of things. So we need to revision, discovering or rediscovering those symbols, those signs, and those clues from the past and how they deal with the situation now. Reconciliation or revision. Finally, they say. Okay, so what do you call this place? And here's one thing that I really like to share, and that's the name of our country, Canada, comes from the Cree word kanatan, or Algonquian word, which is a form of Cree anyway. It means a clean, pure, sacred place. But when you remove the N from kanatan, it becomes kanata, and kanata becomes a verb. So our country is not a noun, it's a verb, because it's based on action. It means to make pure, clean, or sacred. And it becomes a directive. So when you hear, oh, Canada, see the flag, then something should be tapping you on the shoulder and saying, are your relationships in order? Because if we're going to achieve Kanatan, a clean, pure, sacred place, we have to practice Canada to get there. That means we have to maintain our relationships. They need to be in order. And the first point of order is to work with yourself here first and who you are, the pain and the healing you need to do. And then you reach out to the ones who are close to you, the ones who love you, and you work with them to make sure those relationships are in order. And then you move out into your community, your extended family, into your city, your province, your country. That's how we should be seeing Canada today, because we are in relationship. This is a human experience. It's not a transnational corporation experience. It's a human experience. You have to ask the question, what am I doing to maintain my relationships? How are we going to work to renew our relationship, to build that respect, that peace, that understanding with each other? Because the elders have taught this lesson from as many elders I've spoken to. It's all about relationships, and that's the key. Because human beings are particular kind of animals that need that close relationship, not the isolation. We're weaker when we're not talking with each other. We're stronger when we are. That is where I think reconciliation is going to go. It's a return to relationship. And I think, reconciliation can be the verb. Relationship is the noun, the place, the destination. And it's just going to take its time. So I look at it that way, as a return to relationship, because I think that's what the most important thing is right now. So thank you, and I hope that we have enough time for a few questions.
Thank you so much, Louis. We do have a few minutes, I think, for a couple of questions.
And I was surprised to hear that you were connected with retrieving the Big Bear medicine bundle. My great-grandfather was at Fort Pitt during the Riel resistance, spared, I guess, from what could have been quite a battle when there was a peace agreement or a settlement to allow the police there to leave that fort and to go in peace. I would sure be interested in hearing your understanding of that story, perhaps maybe today, maybe a different time. It's kind of a long story, I think. My other question, too, or my other issue, of course, I'm involved with the Edmonton chapter of the Council of Canadians, and we've certainly would like to be able to work more with the Indigenous communities. And there's some question as to whether or not the notion of being the Council of Canadians would be appropriate in that case, given that Canadians, to some degree, is a colonial term, but I guess not in the way that you've described it. So I'm just interested in your opinion about how, about that. Thank you.
The Big Bear story is an awesome story. It deserves a whole lot of other time. But thanks for remembering that as well. But with your second question, it's about bridging, still, there's a distance between Indigenous people and organizations with other organizations. We're still working on the trust issues. But I think when you're consistent in trying to make a relationship, especially when you're trying to work with an Indigenous community or an Indigenous organization, it is about the consistency of reaching out and creating opportunities to get to know each other. Invitations really help, and consistent ones as well. I always advise non-Indigenous people to speak with an Indigenous person who can help guide you into that relationship, or at least opening that door into a conversation. I've done that for many different organizations and people. You know, the caution is not to rush in and say, hey, we want to do this big project and this and that. That can come a little bit later, but you know, the aspect of trying to get to know each other and getting together and seeing what the common ground is might even reshape what your ask is going to be. Showing up at Indigenous events and activities is also a sign of care and a sign of a willingness to work in relationship. And, you know, we're not used to that. Seeing what's happened over the last 30 years is just really amazing. I never thought I'd see the days that we have now. It's filled with hope, but also, you know, a bit of trepidation. So it's just that reaching out, creating that initiative to create a first contact relationship sort of thing. So, and it's doable, and I'm willing to help you with anything that you might need. And I don't think the term Council of Canadians is anything negative, because the word comes from our language in the first place. So, yeah, thank you.
I wanted to ask you about land transfer, because I saw it featured in the presentation about reconciliation involving getting money back, getting the land back.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask how it might look in a place like on Treaty 6 territory or elsewhere, and drawing from what we heard yesterday in Paul Kershaw's discussion about the role of housing as sort of a saving vehicle, maybe an unintentional savings vehicle, maybe inequitable and unequal. But how would it look in a circumstance where there's land transfer? Would cities be involved? Could they? What would the vision be that would be the most just solution, do you think?
Some of our provinces, there are more Indigenous organizations and nations within those provinces are a bit more advanced than we are here in Alberta. With the land transfers, the land back movement, if you want to call it that, there are a number of land trusts that have been created. And sometimes they're created in partnership with other non-Indigenous organizations, for example. But that land transfer then allows it to at least have that stewardship over it until the First Nations or the Indigenous communities decide how they want to utilize that land and how they want to do it. You know, in the last 2 months, I've been offered 2 parcels of land. I said, well, I can't take it myself, of course, as much as it, you know. But I got to be a man of principle. I'm talking Treaty 6, Treaty 7, Treaty 8 to formulate some sort of land trust, because people really do want to give back land. And land is everything for Indigenous traditions and cultures. So a process like that might work better than now. There are some who are just donating it to not-for-profit organizations or charity organizations as well. And that does meet a lot of needs too. It's so fresh, and it's really relatively new, this whole land back sort of thing, that we're still working out the legalese on it and how things should or couldn't work. So right now, there's some movement in that direction to create land trusts.
Louis,
Yep.
thank you, and may we continue to work and build our relationships with you and your families.
Absolutely. Thank you.